Also, in terms of workloads, Australia's bowlers are going to be bowling extra hard in the first test because there's an auction in the middle of it.
It is without doubt the 21st century's biggest test rivalry. They have delivered classics consistently over the last 2 decades. The last 4 iterations of this series all have been fiercely contested. But as India arrive in Australia jilted by recent events, will we see a one-sided Border-Gavaskar trophy? That's the question we're asking on ESPNcricinfo Run Order. We've got our Run Order regulars, Ronak, Dustin and George. But giving us company this time from Australia is Alex Malcolm. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time and company. Dustin, why don't you start us off and why don't you tell us why this is starting to feel like 2011-12 again?
Yeah, well, it's starting to feel like 2011-12 because both years begun with India drawing a series in South Africa after being 1-0 down. They won then in 2011 and this year won a World Cup after a long wait. And then after all that euphoria, there was a very quick come down with the series whitewash. This time's actually even worse because then India were whitewashed in England. This time it's at home against New Zealand. And now we're going to Australia. India's going to Australia like they were in 2011-12. The only sort of ray of light is that back then, the batting transition hadn't begun at all. There were 5 batters in the top 5, all probably in decline in their test career. This time, at least the transition has begun. You've got 2 aging batters who the coach says we should not worry about, but I think most Indian fans are worried about them. But then there are at least, the younger generation is at least part of the team and of the squad already. So that's the one difference, but there are a lot of other eerie similarities to 2011-12.
All right. I want to get for the superstitious type, Justin. But anyway.
He's become a superstitious man.
It's not. This is not superstition. It's. I mean, there's a logic to it. There's India sticking with a certain group of players because they want them to be the ones to win a World Cup, and then they finally do it. And I wouldn't say it's a complacency, but it's difficult to then, I think, get yourself motivated again after that. And that seems to be what's happening with this Indian team, like it did in 2011-12.
That's not a logic. That's an opinion. That's not a logic. No logic behind that.
All right. I'll get Ronak, George, both of you to get some logic into the debate. But I want to go to Alex first and just get a sense of what do you make of this whole doomsday chronicling from an India perspective? I mean, it almost feels like it's Joe Root's England arriving in 2021 and not so much this Indian side, which up until a month ago felt like a world-beating unit. What is the sense in Australia within the team, be it the media, be it the fans?
The sense is that it'll still be the strong India that's turned up in the previous 2 tours. There isn't a sense here that India is in a real decline. There is an acknowledgement that they are vulnerable and there's issues particularly with the batting, but there's just a belief that knowing what Australian fans saw and the Australian media and the Australian team saw in both 2018-19 and 2020-21, that the team India is going to turn up and be powerful. They beat Australia in Brisbane with basically a 3rd string attack. So Australia aren't taking them lightly at all, and Australian fans are expecting India, despite the defeat against New Zealand, to turn up and play really, really well. And Australia knows it's got its own issues actually with its top order, with Cameron Green being out injured. They've got a debutant opening the batting who has no experience basically at first class level opening the batting. And some of their stars have been in decline in recent years, including Steve Smith. And then they've got 2 guys coming off a month's worth of paternity leave in Travis Head and Mitchell Marsh. So there's probably a lot more internal concern in Australia than there is regarding India. They feel like India is still going to be a force, even though they haven't been playing well.
All right. Ronak, George, bring us back to India. I mean, you have to think as Indian fans that how much worse can it be than a side that was 36 all out and then the kind of 11 they had at Gabba? If those teams won, why can't this team go and compete?
So, if you just look back to 2018-19 and 2020-21, like India didn't enter those tours with, that much hope of winning in Australia either. And they managed to do what no other Asian team has done, not once but twice, and overcame significant difficulties during those tours. This shock defeat to New Zealand was bizarre. It was unprecedented. But I do feel the batters might enjoy playing on a little bit of pace with a little bit of bounce on those wickets more than the lottery of the spinning tracks in India, where you don't even get value for shots when you play them. So there've been these really unexpected results. So I don't think it's so easy to predict what a 5-test series is going to turn out. I think the tests will be competitive. Like the series score line in the end might swing one way, but I feel the test matches will have competitive passages of play all through, and it will not be a blowout. As I don't know, I don't know who's saying it's going to be a blowout.
I mean,
The rational, logical Indian fan is saying that.
Yeah, because he wants a 4-0, right? And that would be so disappointing from a competition point of view. I think George makes a really good point. India have overcome greater odds to win in Australia, let alone compete. And the challenge we have now about the Indian team in decline, we're essentially looking at batters on their last legs, batting in transition. We don't really associate bowling transition. We don't really care as much also about them. And we're also a little more confident about the reserve bowling that we do have. I think we'll compete with the ball, or India will compete with the ball. But yeah, if you ask the Indian batters right now, would you rather play on the rank turners in India, or would you actually rather go and play on surfaces that will offer the seamer some assistance, but they'll be bounce and you'll get value for your shots? Most of them would actually be thrilled to be playing in Australia now. I think they'd be a lot more concerned if the next test assignment to secure their WTC hopes would have been again on these surfaces, on these pitches that we saw against New Zealand. So I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I think they'll compete, and I think the series is of great value to a lot of people individually, which has invariably worked well in Indian cricket. A lot of people know their careers might be on the line. A lot of people know they might only get 1 or 2 tests before which a decision might be made on their at least short-term future. With the kind of situation we have, with maybe an Iswaran will get 2 tests, maybe KL Rahul will only get 1 test. Those kind of situations invariably have led to their best output. So I think India will compete as long as they actually put in half a decent shift with the bat. I'm not as concerned about their efforts with the ball. I think this is still a very strong bowling lineup. And after Gabba 2021, I'm not going to judge any bowling lineup in Australia. So they can win with anybody. So yeah, if they start well at Perth, that's key. If we're talking about that 3-0, 4-0, quite frankly, if India, for whatever reason, have one bad session, which they also are capable of, they're very capable of having a bad session. If they have it in Perth, and if it happens, if the team enters Adelaide low on confidence, Adelaide is perhaps the toughest one to win out of the 5 that they do have. They could win elsewhere. But if they're 2-0 down very quickly, then it could get ugly. But I don't think they will be 2-0 down.
I want to follow up on the bowling part of the conversation, because if you look at those 2 series in 18-19 and 2021, barring the Gabba test, which of course takes its romantic heights, India did have Bumrah. India had Shami for a large part of it. They had Ishant in 18-19. Does anyone here feel that the lack of quality proven bowling support for Bumrah could be potentially a big hindrance for India?
No, actually, I think the bowling is not as big a concern, because firstly, I think Bumrah has actually hit a new level now. I think he's actually better than he was even in the previous 2 tours. So you've got a spearhead who's the best test bowler in the world, I think. I think Siraj is still, in Australian conditions, going to be very effective. And I think Akash Deep is just as good as a lot of Indian pacers who've travelled to Australia before. And you've got Prasidh and Harshit. I actually think India's best chance is if they end up bowling first in Perth, which they might have to lose the toss to do that, or they may choose to do that. But if they bowl first and can bowl Australia out for less than 150, then suddenly maybe that will give the batter some confidence. So that's probably the one thing that might then give India a bit of an impetus for the rest of the series.
So here we've talked a lot about India right now, but I wanted to ask Alex, and he spoke about the concerns around that Aussie batting, because there's an unsettled opening combination. I was looking at Marnus Labuschagne's recent form in the Shield, hasn't been great. Without Cameron Green in the series, Travis Head is bound to run out of luck at some point, against India especially. Yeah. So yeah, there must be concerns there as well.
Absolutely, there are. And as I said, Head and Marsh haven't played for a month. They've both, Travis has had just his second child come in the last few days. Mitch Marsh, as I understand, is still waiting on his first child to arrive. So it's getting a little bit close. So their preparation is going to be compromised, and there's a lot of reliance on Head actually in the middle order. And his form in white ball cricket has been absolutely spectacular over the last 12 months, but his red ball performances since probably the WTC final have been a little bit on the decline. He had a so-so Ashes series and then a pretty lean summer last year with the exception of 100 in Adelaide, where he chanced his arm on a really difficult wicket. The thing about Australian pitches at the moment, they are very different to the 2018, 19 and 2020, 2021 pitches now. The pitches they played on last summer at home were very, very difficult for batting. There's a lot of grass being left on by the curators. I am told Perth's going to be probably a little better on day one than it was last year. They're trying to avoid it cracking up, but it is a month earlier this time than it was this time last year when it was extremely hot. But there's been bounce and pace in every surface with the exception of the SCG. Even the MCG now, as the India A guys found out against Australia last week, has been really, really difficult to bat on ever since India last toured here. It's become an absolute nightmare, actually, for opposing batters. So it's going to be a challenge for everybody, and the Australian batters are aware that they're under some pressure. And you mentioned Labuschagne, his numbers at home recently, and his numbers in Test cricket over the last sort of year and a half have been not so good. So, yeah, there's pressure on that Australian lineup, and they know it.
And there are also enough people in this Indian team that actually understand that this Australian team is beatable, which helps going to Australia, a reference point to how they've managed to do it against significant odds. And the challenges that Alex speaks of, you add to that their bowling, formidable as it may seem, it does run out of gas in a long series. And I think that's the hope for the Indian team, that yes, there's Stark, Hazelwood, Cummins, but in a 5-test series, if you can put in a shift of the 100+ over stints over and over, something that Pujara managed to get the Australian bowlers to do, wear them down. You stand a chance going into the Boxing Day test or even going into Gabba. But if you're 2-0 down there, shoulders could drop quickly. I think the other thing I'll quickly say on taking advantage of Australia's limitations or what the slight areas of concern, I think Cameron Green's a big one. But this is also where India's planning comes into question. Why they were so successful on their last two tours, there's a lot of credit that needs to go to their coaching staff, the bowling plans that they set up. And they did surprise Australia with some of it. They may not have had the skill. And I think we've put out some really good analysis videos on it, on how they came well prepared, how to stop Steve Smith, how to stop their scoring areas, how to try and choke Australia into doing something different. This is going to be a test for Monomokal, for Gautam Gambhir, both of whom would not have had the smoothest starts. But this is where they also earn their chips, don't they? That this is where you want your coach of experience, of having played there. Let's come up with a way to surprise everyone. This is India's way now. That was India's way back then. So I think that's going to be under the scanner too. And therefore, so will be their selections. What kind of team they pick, looking at the pitch. They've been caught with a little bit of scrutiny on that as well with the recent home series. So I think all that's going to come into play. If India managed to get most of that right, who knows?
I just want to go back to that bowling workload point, especially given the importance of Jasprit Bumrah. While we talk about Australia's pacers potentially tiring themselves out, what about Jasprit Bumrah? The amount of load he carries and the knowledge that he's never played 5 tests in a row before, could that be a big factor in this series?
Well, there are decent gaps between the first 2 tests. So, that shouldn't be that much of a concern. And he didn't play the last one in Mumbai as well.
Yeah.
I
don't think he played much in Pune before that either.
Yeah. But bowling workloads are a concern. And I think that's where the kind of batter who can, bat time becomes valuable in Australia, because it's not just within a test match where you send bowlers into their second and third and fourth spells, but also across the series. Then, they're not as fresh for that second test or the third test and all of that. And I think, the value of Pujara, Vihari and the skills that they bring to test cricket, I think that will be missed. Someone like, KL Rahul, when he's batting well, has that ability, or even Rohit Sharma, but they'll have to turn around their form to prove that they can bat some time as well. So I think, it is important to wear bowlers down in Australia, but I'm not sure who has this patience or the defense to do that right.
Yeah.
Specifically
and
on
remember,
Bumrah, Yeah, specifically on Bumrah, I'm not too concerned. But yeah, if India do go 4-0 up, they can rest Bumrah for the fifth.
And remember that also in terms of workloads, Australia's bowlers are going to be bowling extra hard in the first test because there's an auction in the middle of it.
Dustin and me both had some zingers after George's.
Dustin, you started as the only one who appeared confident with the question about this.
No,
being a
you
one-sided.
just asked me why it felt like 2011-12. You didn't ask me if it was going to be
Also,
a one-sided series.
you're not agreeing. So
I
is
mean,
there
rationally, it very well could be, but I think it all depends on the first test. India, I think, have to win the first test, honestly. Because I agree with Ronak, winning the pink ball test is very difficult for India. They're most likely going to lose that. And if they're 2-0 down, then it's going to be one-sided. But India have to win in Perth. So this is the way they had to win at the Gabba in 2020-21.
Okay, let's get predictions around the room. Alex, why don't you start us off?
I think it could be really tight. I think it could be 3-2 Australia. It could be that tight. I really do. I just don't have a lot of faith in either batting lineup, and I think both bowling sides are going to be having their say on some pretty spicy pitches. So I'll go 3-2 Australia.
George.
3-2 to India.
Whoa. Dustin.
Miles?
I'll say 4-1 Australia.
Ronak.
3-2 Australia.
Okay, that does it. Quite clearly, we will not see a one-sided Border-Gavaskar trophy.